Welcome back, everybody. Today we will be reading Chapter 16 of The Magicians. So let's get into it. Chapter 16, Penny's Story. He had a new mohawk, a proud, iridescent green ruff an inch wide and 3 inches high, like the crest of a centurion's helmet. He had also gained weight. He looked oddly younger and softer than he had at Breakbills. Less like a lone Iroquois warrior, and more like an overfed white suburban gangsta. But it was still Penny who was catching his breath on the oriental rug and looking around at everything like a curious, judgmental rabbit. He wore a black leather jacket with chrome spikes on it, faded black jeans, and a grubby white t-shirt. Jesus, Quentin thought. Do they even have punks anymore? He must be the last one in New York. Penny sniffed and wiped his nose on his sleeve. Neither of them spoke. Quentin knew enough to know that Penny would never stop to petty social pleasantries like saying hello and asking how he'd been and explaining what the hell he was doing here. Just this once, Quentin was grateful. He didn't know if he could face it. "How'd you get in here?" Quentin croaked. His mouth was parched. "Your doorman was asleep. You should really fire him." "It's not my doorman." He cleared his throat laboriously. "You must have cast something." "Just Cholomdesky's stealth." Penny gave it the correct English pronunciation. Chumley's. "Elliot has a ward on this whole floor. I helped him set it up. Plus, you need a key for the elevator. We'll need to set a new ward. I unpicked it on the way up." Fucking... Okay, first, who's we? We who? Quentin said. At this moment, his dearest wish would have been just a moment's grace to immerse his face in a sinkful of warm water, and maybe to have somebody hold him under until he drowned. And second, Penny, Jesus, it took us a whole weekend to put up that ward. He did a quick check. Penny was right. The defensive spells around the apartment were gone. So gone that they hadn't even alerted him when they were going. Quentin couldn't quite believe it. Penny must have taken down their ward from the outside on the fly, from a standing start. In no more time than it took him to ride up 10 floors in an elevator. Quentin kept his face blank. He didn't want to give Penny the satisfaction of seeing how impressed he was. "What about the key?" Penny dug it out of his jacket pocket and tossed it to Quentin. "Took it off your doorman," he shrugged. "Kind of thing you learn on the street." Quentin was going to say something about how the street in question was probably not a street at all, but a way or a lane located in some gated community. And anyway, it wasn't that hard to steal a key from a sleeping doorman when you were rocking Chumley's stealth, but it just seemed so unimportant, and the words were just too heavy to get out of his mouth. Like they were stone blocks in his stomach that he would have had to physically cough up and regurgitate. Fuck Penny. He was wasting time. And he had to talk to Alice. But by then, people had heard Penny's voice. Richard came shambling in from the kitchen where he'd been cleaning up, already awake and irritatingly showered and coiffed and groomed and pressed. Soon, Janet came out of Elliot's room, regally swathed in a comforter as if nothing whatsoever unusual had happened the night before. She squeaked when she saw Penny and disappeared into a bathroom. Quentin realized he would have to get dressed and deal with this. Daylight was here, and with it had come the world of appearances and lies and acting like everything was fine. They were all going to make scrambled eggs and talk about how hungover they were and drink mimosas and Bloody Marys with extra Tabasco and black pepper and act like nothing was wrong. As if Quentin hadn't just broken Alice's heart for no better reason than that he was drunk and felt like it. And as unbelievable, as unthinkable as it seemed, They were going to listen to what Penny had to say. He was a year behind Quentin and Alice, but by the end of his 4th year, Penny had decided, he explained, once his audience was assembled and dressed and arranged around him in the living room with drinks and plates, standing or laying full length on couches or sitting cross-legged on the floor, as their physical and emotional conditions permitted, that Brakebills had taught him everything it was going to teach him. So he dropped out and moved to a small town in Maine, a few miles north of Bar Harbor. The town was called Olso, a seedy little resort village with a population that shrank by 80% in the off-season. Penny chose Olso, not even New Olso, just Olso, as if they thought they came up with it first, for its total lack of anything that might distract him. He arrived in mid-September and had no trouble renting a small farmhouse on the outskirts of town on a one-lane rural route. His landlord was a retired schoolteacher who handed him the keys and then fled to his winter home in South Carolina. Penny's nearest neighbors on either side were a congressionless, one-shack Pentecostal church and an out-of-session summer camp for disturbed children. It was perfect. He had found his Walden. He had everything he needed: silence, solitude, a U-Haul trailer packed with an inviolable library of magical codices, monographs, chapbooks, reference books, and broadsheets. He had a sturdy desk, a well-lit room, and a window with an unscenic view of an unknown backyard that offered no particular temptation to gaze out at. He had a manageable and intriguingly dangerous research project that showed every sign of maturing into a genuinely interesting line of inquiry. He was in heaven. But one afternoon, a few weeks after he arrived, as he sat at his desk, his watery blue eyes trailing over words of consummate power, written centuries ago with a pen made out of a hippogriff feather, Penny found his mind wandering. His large, usually lineless brow crinkled. Something was sapping his powers of concentration. He was under attack, maybe by a rival researcher? Who would dare? He rubbed his eyes and shook his head and focused harder, but his attention continued to drift. It turned out that Penny had discovered in himself a weakness, a flaw he never would have suspected himself of in 1,000 years, an age to which, with a few careful modifications, that he would look into when he had the time, he had every intention of living. The flaw was this: he was lonely. The idea was outrageous. It was humiliating. He, Penny, was a stone-cold loner, a desperado. He was the Han Solo of Oslo. He knew and loved this about himself. He had spent 4 interminable years at Brakebills surrounded by idiots, except for Melanie, as he privately referred to Professor Vanderweeg. And now, he was finally free of their incessant bullshit. But now, Penny found himself doing things for no reason. Unproductive things. He stood on a concrete dam near the farmhouse and threw down rocks to break up the thin crust of ice that formed on the outflow pond. He walked the 1.5 miles to the center of town and played video games in the windowless video arcade back behind the pharmacy, stuffing his mouth with stale gumballs from the gumball machine, alongside the no-hope, dead-eyed teenagers who hung out there and did the exact same thing. He made awkward, inexperienced eyes at the underage clerk at the book bin, which actually sold mostly stationery and greeting cards, not books. He confided his troubles to the miserable pod of 4 buffalo who lived on the buffalo farm out on the Bar Harbor Road. He thought about climbing over the fence and petting one of their huge, wedge-shaped heads, but he didn't quite have the nerve. They were big buffalo, and you never knew what they were thinking. That was September. By October, he had bought an herb green Subaru Impreza and was making regular trips to a dance club in Bangor, swinging from a fifth of vodka on the passenger seat, since the club was all ages and didn't serve alcohol, as he drove the 45 minutes through trackless pine forests. Progress on his research project had dwindled to almost nothing. A couple of hours a day of listless leafing through old notes, punctuated by generous breaks for online porn. It was humiliating. The dance club in Bangor was open only on Friday and Saturday nights, and all he did there was shoot pool in a half-lit lounge area off the main dance floor, with other creepy male loners like himself. But it was in that half-lit lounge on one of those Saturday nights that he spotted, to his secret consternation, and even more secret relief and gratitude, a familiar face. It was a hard face to like, the face of an emaciated corpse that hadn't been particularly attractive even in life, with a horrible pencil mustache on its upper lip. It belonged to the itinerant salesman, Lovelady. Lovelady was in the dance club in Bangor for approximately the same reason that Penny was there. He had run as far away as he could from the world of breakbills and magic and then gotten lonely. Over a pitcher of Coors Light and a few games of pool, all of which Lovelady won handily. You don't spend a lifetime trafficking in fake magical items without picking up a few real skills. They exchanged stories. Lovelady depended heavily for his livelihood on luck and the gullibility of strangers. He spent most of his time trolling the world's junk shops and estate sales, the way long-line fishermen troll the ocean. He accosted the emotionally vulnerable windows of recently deceased magicians and loitered on the outskirts of the conversations of his wisers and betters, keeping his eye out for anything that had value or that might plausibly be made to appear to have value. He had spent the past few months in northern England, in a studio apartment over a garage in a dreary suburb of Hull, trying his luck in antique stores and second-hand bookshops. His days were spent on buses, and when he was really down on his luck, on an ancient one-speed bicycle he borrowed without permission from the garage, which he wasn't supposed to have access to. At some point during the stay, Lovelady began to receive unwanted attention. Normally, he was desperate for anybody to pay attention to him, anybody at all, but this was very different. Strangers on buses stared fixedly at him for no reason. Payphones rang when he walked by them. When he counted his change, he found only coins from the year he was born. When he watched TV, all he saw was an image of his own face, with a mysterious empty city in the background. Lovelady was neither learned nor particularly intelligent, but he survived on his instincts, and all his instincts told him that something was gravely amiss. Alone in his apartment, sitting on his pea soup-colored foam couch, Lovelady took stock. His best guess was this. He had inadvertently acquired an object of genuine power, and something out there coveted it. He was being hunted. That same night, he pulled up stakes. He abandoned his security deposit, donned a rattling array of charms and fetishes, took a bus to London, and the Channel train to Paris, and from there crossed the Atlantic to throw himself on the already overtaxed mercy of breakbills. He spent an exhausting afternoon combing the woods north of New York for the school's familiar, comforting compound. As the sun set through the trees, and the early winter chill gnawed at the tips of his ears, the horrifying truth sank in. He was in the right place, but breakbills would no longer appear to him. Something, either him or his wares, was objectionable to the school's defensive spells. Whatever he was carrying had rendered him untouchable. That was when he cut and ran to Maine. It was ironic. For once in his life, Lovelady had lucked into something genuinely powerful, a big score, but it was too much luck all at once. He was out of his league. He could have dumped his stock, all of it, right there in the middle of the frozen woods, but after a lifetime of greedy scrimping, he didn't quite have the gumption. It would have broken his Avarious heart. Instead, he rented a cozy cabin in the woods at the off-season rate, and conducted a thorough inventory. He recognized it right away, mixed in with a jumbled consignment of grubby costume jewelry in a plastic bag tied with a twisty. He didn't know what it was, but its power was obvious even to the untrained eye. He motioned Penny over to a corner, reached into the pocket of his seedy overcoat, which he hadn't taken off all night, and laid the baggie on a round particle board bar table. He grinned his livid, discolored grin at Penny. The buttons were ordinary surplus vintage buttons. 2 holes, 4 holes, fake leather, fake tortoiseshell, big angular novelty knobs, and tiny Bakelite pinpricks. A few of them were just leftover beads. Penny's eye immediately went to one of them, a flat, otherwise unremarkable pearlescent white overcoat button, about an inch across. It was heavier than it should have been. It practically vibrated with barely contained magical force. He knew what it was. He knew better than to touch it. "A magic button?" Janet said. "How weird. What was it?" Her hair was a disaster, but she was obscenely relaxed, sipping coffee in an armchair, showing off her legs in a short silk bathrobe. She obviously felt triumphant, relishing her conquest and by extension her victory over Alice. Quentin hated her at that moment. "You really don't know," Penny said. Quentin thought he had a guess, but he wasn't going to say it out loud. "What did you do?" he said instead. "I made him come back with me to my house, that night. He wasn't safe where he was, and at least I had a basic security set up. We called the woman who sold him the consignment, but she insisted the buttons weren't in her records. The next day, we went and got his stuff and drove to Boston, and I gave him $80,000 for it. He wouldn't take cash, just gold and diamonds. I practically cleaned out a Harry Winston, but it was worth it. Then I told him to fuck off, and he did." $80,000, Elliot said. "Wouldn't clear out a display case at a Zales, let alone a Harry Winston." Penny ignored him. "That was 2 days ago. That button attracts attention. I was staying at a hotel in Boston, but last night a fire 2 floors above me killed a cleaning lady. I never went back to my room. I took the Funghua bus from South Station. I had to walk here from Chinatown. Whenever I got in a cab, the engine would die. But what matters is that it's real and it's ours." "Ours? Who are we?" Richard asked. "You," Quentin said coldly, "are a fucking nut job." "Quentin gets it," Penny said. "Anybody else?" "Q, what is he talking about?" A silent spear of pure, glistening ice entered Quentin's heart. He hadn't heard Alice come in. She stood at the edge of the circle, her hair unwashed and adrift, like a sleepy child who wakes in the middle of the night and appears like an uncertain spirit at the edge of a grown-up party. "He doesn't know what he's talking about," Quentin muttered. He couldn't look at her. He was drowning in remorse. It almost made him angry at her. How much it hurt to look at her. "Do you want to explain it, or should I?" Penny said. "You do it. I'm not going to be able to say it without laughing my head off." "Well, somebody say something, or I'm going back to bed," Elliot said. "Ladies and gentlemen," Penny said, gravely and grandly, "we are all going to Fillory." At the end of the Wandering Dune, Penny began. It was a lecture he had obviously rehearsed. Helen and Jane Chatwin received a gift from Highbound, the captain of the rabbit-crewed clipper ship that the girls encounter in the desert. The gift is a little brass-bound oak chest containing 5 magical buttons, all different shapes and colors, one for each of the Chatwins, each with the power to take the wearer from Earth to Fillory and back again at will. Everybody in the room had read the Fillory books, in Quentin's case multiple times, but Penny rehearsed the rules anyway. The buttons don't take you directly there. First, they move you to a kind of in-between netherworld, an interdimensional layover, and from there, you can make the leap to Fillory. No one knows where this transitional world is. It may be an alternate plane of existence, or a place between planes, interleaved between them like a flower pressed between pages, or a master plane that contains all planes, the spine that gathers the pages and binds them together. To the naked eye, it looks like a deserted city, an endless series of empty stone squares, but it serves as a kind of multi-dimensional switchboard. In the center of each square is a fountain. Step into one of them, the story goes, and you'll be transported to another universe. There are hundreds of different squares, possibly an infinite number, and a corresponding number of alternate universes. The bunnies call this place the Netherlands, because it's neither here nor there, or sometimes just the city. But the most important point, Penny said, is that at the end of the Wandering Dune, Helen hid all the buttons somewhere in her aunt's house in Cornwall. She felt they were too mechanical. They made the journey too easy. Their power was wrong. You shouldn't be able to just go to Fillory whenever you wanted, like catching a bus, she argued. A trip to Fillory had to be earned. That had always been the way. It was a reward for the worthy, bestowed by the ram gods Umber and Ember. The buttons were a perversion of this divine grace, a usurping of it. They broke the rules. Ember and Umber couldn't control them. Fillory was fundamentally a religious fantasy, but the buttons weren't religious at all. They were magical. They were just tools with no values attached. You could use them for anything you wanted, good or evil. They were so magical, they were practically technological. So she hid them. Jane was inconsolable, understandably enough, and tore up half the property looking for them. But according to the Wandering Dune, she never found them, and Plover never wrote any more books. The Wandering Dune ends in the summer of 1917, or possibly 1918. Because of the lack of real-world detail, it's impossible to date it precisely. After that, the whereabouts of the buttons is unknown. But try a thought experiment, Penny suggested. How long could a box of buttons hidden by a 12-year-old girl plausibly have stayed hidden? 10 years? 50? Nothing stays hidden forever. Wasn't it possible, even inevitable, that in the decades that followed a maid or a real estate agent or another little girl would have found them again? And that, from there, they would have made their way onto the magical gray market. I always thought they were supposed to be lapel buttons, Richard said. Like a pen. Oh, lapel buttons, Richard said. Like a pen, like I like Ike. Okay, so let's back up for a second, Quentin said cheerily. He was in the perfect mood for somebody, anybody besides himself, to make an ass of himself. And if that person could be Penny, and if Quentin could help him do it, then ever so much the better. The Fillory books are fiction? Nothing you're talking about actually happened? Yes and no, Penny said, surprisingly reasonably. I'll allow that much of Plover's narrative might be fictional, or fictionalized. But I've come to believe that the basic mechanics of interdimensional travel that Plover describes are quite real. Really. Quentin knew Penny well enough to know that he never bluffed, but he kept going anyway out of pig-headedness, urged on by his own inner vileness. And what makes you think that? Penny regarded him with benevolent pity as he prepared the hammer blow. Well, I can certainly tell you that the Netherlands are very real. I've spent most of the past 3 years there." No one had an answer to this. The room was silent. Quentin finally dared to glance over at Alice, but her face was a mask. It would almost have been better if she looked angry. "I don't know if you know this," Penny said. "In fact, I'm pretty sure you don't. But I did most of my work at Breakbills on travel between alternate worlds, or between planes, as we call them, Melanie and I. As far as we could determine, it was an entirely new discipline. Not that I was the first person ever to study the subject, but I was the first to have a special aptitude for it. My talents were so unusual that Melanie, Professor Vanderweeg, decided to pull me out of regular classes and give me my own course of study. The spellcraft was extremely involved, and I had to improvise a lot of it. I can tell you, a lot of what's in the canon on this stuff is way off base. Way off base. They're not seeing the whole picture, and the part of it they are seeing is by far the least important part. You'd think your friend Bigby would have some grasp on this stuff, but he has no idea. I was surprised, I really was. But there were still some issues I couldn't resolve. Such as? Elliot said. Well, so far I've only been able to travel alone. I can transport my body and clothes and some small supplies, but nothing else and nobody else. Second, I can cross to the Netherlands. But that's it. I'm stuck there. The wider multiverse is closed to me. You mean, said Janet. Wait, so you've been to this amazing magical Interville, but that's it? She actually looked underwhelmed. I thought you were coming in here this badass multidimensional desperado and all. No. Penny could be defensive when he felt like he was under attack, but he was so autistically focused right now that even direct mockery bounced right off him. My explorations have been limited to the city. It's quite a rich environment in itself, an amazingly complex artifact to a magically trained eye. There's so little information in the books. The Wandering Dune is told through the eyes of a child, and it's not clear to me that either Plover or the Chatwins had any particular command of the techniques they describe. I thought at first that the entire place was a kludge, a virtual environment that functioned as a kind of three-dimensional interface hacked onto a master interdimensional switchboard. Not that it's much of an interface. A maze of identical unlabeled squares. How much help is that? But it was all I could think of. The thing is, the more I study it, the more I think it's exactly the opposite. That our world has much less substance than the city, and what we experience as reality is really just a footnote to what goes on there. An epiphenomenon. But now that we have the button, he patted his jeans pocket, we'll learn so much more. We'll go so much further. Have you tried it? Richard asked. Penny hesitated. For somebody who so obviously wanted to be hardcore, he was painfully transparent. Of course he hasn't, Quentin said, smelling blood. He's scared shitless. He has no idea what that thing is, only that it's dangerous as hell, and he wants one of us to be a guinea pig. It's absolutely not true, Penny said. His ears were getting red. An artifact on this level is best faced in the company of allies and observers, with the proper controls and safeguards. No reasonable magician... Look, Penny. Now Quentin could play the reasonable one, and he did it with maximum nastiness. Slow down. You've gotten so far ahead of yourself you can't even see how you got there. You've seen an old city, and a bunch of pools and fountains, and you've got a button with some heavy-duty enchantments on it. And you're looking for some framework to fit them all together. And you've latched on to this Fillory thing. But you're grasping at straws. It's crazy. You're cramming a few chance data points into a story that has nothing to do with reality. You need to take a giant step back. Take a deep breath. You're way off the reservation. Nobody spoke. The skepticism in the room was palpable. Quentin was winning, and he was winning, and he knew it. Penny looked around at his audience, beseechingly, unable to believe that he was losing them. Alice stepped forward into the empty circle around Penny. "Quentin," she said, "you have always been the most unbelievable pussy." Her voice broke only a little as she said it. She grabbed Quentin's wrist with one hand and shoved the other one into the left-hand pocket of Penny's baggy black jeans. She fumbled for an instant. Then they vanished together. That's it for today. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 17.